The broadcast is now starting and all attendees are in a listen-only mode. For your information, this session will be recorded and the recording may be made available to others. The participants list is private so that other participants cannot see your name. The chat function is in private mode as well. Only the speakers and the moderators receive the chat messages. If you do not wish to continue based on the above, please log out. Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to today's special edition of the mindsON RBQM workshop, an initiative by Centrality's My RBQM Academy. I'm Tamara, the operations manager of the Academy, and our topic today, the recently released FDA guidance on RBM. This workshop takes approximately 60 minutes and it is an interactive session with polls, brainstorms and time for your question and our answer at the end. About our speakers, this is Keith Doricott. Keith is heading his independent consulting company, that's Doricott Metrics and Process Improvement. And with a solid background in Lean Six Sigma, business process improvement and root cause analysis, he assists the Metrics Champion Consortium among other activities. Keith holds a bachelor's degree in physics. And here we have Dr. Johan Pröwe. Besides being a much sought-after industry speaker, Johan brings data-driven realism to the table, ensuring that clinical trial risk management goals are implementable in the real world. Johan has a considerable depth of experience in clinical research, which has been invaluable to many. So as already said at the beginning, we want to make this an interactive workshop, and that means later on in this session, I will unlock the toolbar for the brainstorming part that we prepared for you. And in this toolbar, you will see a mug with pens in it. You just click on that and next click on the T box. That opens a box here for you in the middle of our whiteboard and you can start writing. Then you click OK. And whatever you wrote is then available on our whiteboard directly. So the entries, by the way, are anonymous. That means please don't be shy and brainstorm with us later. If you have questions or would like to comment on a subject we are just talking about, then please use the chat box that you see on the right side. And don't forget to click Send to Moderators. So thank you very much for your attention. And I would say now let's start with the workshop. I would like to hand over to Keith, please.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Tamara. And yeah, I'd like to extend my welcome to everyone to this session. We're going to talk about this FDA guidance. So let's begin. So the guidance document is this one is available to all, so you can go and access this on the FDA site, and I'll show you where to find that in a moment. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of context as to where it fits in. So back in 2013, in the mists of time, before even E6R2 was adopted, we had this guidance document. It came out at the same time as one from the EMA as well on the same topic, a risk-based approach to monitoring. So that was back in 2013. Of course, we've had E6R2, we've had E8R1 since then. There's obviously ongoing discussions around E6R3, and we're expecting a draft ready for consultation, public consultation, to come out for that soon. In 2019, there was actually this same document that we're going to discuss today. It was issued as a draft guidance. And when this came up, the latest version, I have to admit, I looked at it and I thought, hang on a minute, I've seen this before. And sure enough, I had. So I had to go back and look. And it was way back in 2019. I can only assume that the pandemic caused a significant delay in the finalization of the draft guidance. I was involved at the MCC at the time, helping organizations put together some feedback for the FDA. So we actually submitted feedback to the FDA on the original draft Q&A, And I'm pleased to say some of that has found its way into this final Q&A. The questions are exactly the same as the draft, but the answers are modified a little bit. So that gives you a little bit of, hopefully, of context for this. It really is, it's additional then to the 2013 document. So it's really, if you haven't read the 2013 one, you really should, because it's additional. The two fit together. So you can find it on the FDA site. If you go out on the FDA site and do a search for risk-based, seems to be the easiest way to find the document, and you can simply download it from there. So we've got a quick poll for you here just to get a little bit of feedback, and then we're going to do a quick brainstorm as well before we get Johan and I get started on our thoughts and review of the document.
Which of the following applies to you in relation to the recent FDA RBM Q&A guidance? And you can select more than one answer if you wish. Just waiting a little bit longer. The answers are still coming in. Thanks very much. Which of the following applies to you in relation to the recent FDA RBM Q&A guidance? So, and I'm closing the poll now. We have 49 answers. I'm presenting the results now. Keith?
Thank you. Thanks, Tamara. Yes, so we've got, I guess, the most responded one is I plan to read the guidance, and then we've got I'm aware of the guidance. So not so many have actually read the guidance, and then of course we've got, well, of course if you haven't read it, you're probably not getting into considering changes or in fact making changes. So that's interesting. Of course it has only just come out, and they always look like they're really long documents to read. Whilst we're going to be talking through our highlights from the document, do remember that we're not talking through the whole document. The best thing to do is actually to go and read the document, but hopefully we'll give you some pointers of things to look out as you read it. And as I say, the other thing is that it's in addition to the 2013 document. So if you haven't read the 2013, I do recommend you read that as well as this latest Q&A. Thanks, Tamara. Well, we've got a brainstorm next. So we just, for those that have read it, which may be relatively few perhaps, are there any particular areas in the guidance that stand out for you? And so as Tamara described earlier, you can use that cup with the tools in it, and you can select the T, which is to type text on the screen, and just put your ideas, anything in particular that stands out in the guidance for you, obviously if you've had a chance to look at it in any detail. So as a piece on source data verification, yes, we saw that. It's rather interesting in the centralized monitoring part. There's quite a bit on blinding. There's a little section on blinding. There's a question specific related to that. Yeah. addresses the main risks to the trial. Yeah, so it's again, it's of course it's very much about the sort of the risk, the overall risk-based approach. It doesn't use, I don't think it used the term sort of errors that matter or critical to quality factors. That terminology we're now getting more of in E8R1 and in the principles, at least for E6R3. Yeah, nothing hugely surprising. What should go into the monitoring plan versus the risk management plan? Interesting. One of the bits of feedback that the MCC gave was, can you please define the monitoring plan? And I don't think they've done that in this document, unfortunately. Yeah, there's, I think, still a level of confusion around what monitoring really means. How broad is monitoring? And something on sampling. Great, thank you. That's useful. Well, let's move on then to our review of the document. As I said, it's additional guidance to the 2013 guidance. So this is a Q&A. So it doesn't replace the 2013 guidance. It's very much additional, and that's, I've just quoted here direct from the document itself. I think it does align with E6R2 and E8R1 because we've got, and I've underlined the sections here, determine whether risks to critical data and processes may be mitigated through revisions to the protocol and investigational plan. So it's focused on the critical data and processes, just as E6R2 discusses. Such efforts to build quality into the design. So there we go, quality by design, or I guess E8R1, and perspectives from patients is there, which is very much part of E8R1. So to me, it very much aligns with E6R2, E8R1. Again, probably no surprise to that. It'd be a bit concerning if it didn't, I think. And then let's have a look then at the Q&A section. So the Q&A section, there's a number of questions, and we thought it might be easiest to sort of go through each of the questions and answers one by one, just sort of summarize what the FDA is saying, and then just our thoughts around it. So I think, Johan, you're starting off with the first of these.
Yep, that's correct, Keith. Thank you for the introduction. And actually, Keith and I, we went through this document, and for the most part, I think we were pretty much in agreement with the statements made, but there are a couple of areas that we thought are controversial. Let's put it at least that way. And I was quite pleased to see that in the brainstorming session a couple of minutes ago, that whoever put that down already indicated, well, there is some confusion about blinding, and there's some confusion about source data verification by centralized monitoring. So we'll address those cases, and actually a couple more than that. So the structure is such that we are going to go through the various questions, question number 1 up to question number, whatever it was, 8, 9, and provide you with a summary and maybe also a couple of discussion points around those questions and the answers. So question number 1 was, what is the purpose of the risk assessment, and should sponsors document their methodologies and activities for assessing the risks? Well, the answer is from the FDA, summarized here in these 2, 4, 5 bullet points. To eliminate or mitigate important risks to human subject protection and data integrity, yes, you should document the methodologies and the activities that you applied. The risk assessment should be documented, the method, the conclusions, and the risk decisions. So actually everything that we taught over the past webinars with respect to, how do you identify the critical data and critical processes, how do you score them, and what is it that you ultimately do once a risk materialized, I think that is everything that also the FDA expects to be documented. and that shouldn't be too difficult, and I've seen many cases where companies already did that. The risk assessment should be re-evaluated during the study, and monitoring plans and protocol may need to be revised. Also, that is something we said, that you have to do a risk review on a more or less regular basis, and what more or less regular means needs to be determined and depends on the kind of study. Could be every 6 months, could be every 9 months, but it could also be more frequent at the beginning of a study and then, level off once it's stabilized. But quite interesting to see that this risk reassessment or re-evaluation is something that they also mentioned in their response to this question. The FDA may request documentation during inspections. That shouldn't come as a surprise to us in the industry, because that is what FDA always said, and other health authorities, by the way, as well. So we need to make sure that everything that we decided, everything that we implemented, and even everything that we decided not to implement, that we document it and provide preferably a rationale for it. And the last bullet point that we pulled out from the answers is the monitoring plan should include information on the risks and how monitoring will address those risks. Now, this is not very specific with respect to, is that now the site monitoring plan or is that the central monitoring plan? And maybe it doesn't even matter as long as there is a plan and that an organization documents how you want to approach the risks and how you want to make sure that the risks do not materialize too much in your study. I think it's important, again, to mention that everything is being documented so that your documentation provides, and that is from Keith, provides the story overall and tells an inspector or anybody else, what was your path of decision making and your activities that you then ultimately implemented. Keith, I think you may want to add something.
I was just going to emphasize that last bullet point there. And the way we've talked about it previously in these webinars is by putting the information about the risks in the monitoring plan, monitoring plans, I suppose, is part of communicating the risks. So there are these risks that are relevant to whatever the activities are in that particular plan. There are these risks, and these are the activities that we're taking to try and reduce those risks. So that's part of, I think, a key way that you can help to communicate the risks to the people that need to know about them. So I was pleased to see that in there.
Yeah. And actually, in the brainstorming session, there was a question about where to document the activities in the monitoring plan or in the central monitoring plan. Bottom line, I think it's preferable to have an integrated quality risk management plan, where all the activities can be found and then, organized such that it's the site monitor that addresses an issue, or it's a central monitor, or it is even some other function within an organization, as long as the issues are being addressed. Okay, then let's move on to the second question. Should sponsor monitor only risks that are important and identified during their initial risk assessment as likely to occur? That is certainly jumping probably too short, and the answer is no, they should also monitor additional risks that were not identified before the start of the study. We all realize that when we identify risks and we decide which risks to follow up with, that we have sort of a limited number of risks that we can address. But there may be areas, there may be findings that a site monitor even at a site identifies that he or she only saw at that site and no other monitors at the other sites saw that happening. And such a risk can also be then documented and should be addressed, even if it only happened at one site, because that site might be an important one and make or break a study, a worst case. And some of you may recall that there is something that we call the centralized statistical monitoring tool that also helps to identify potential issues in the data that had not been assessed as critical data and critical processes, but are all the other data that nobody looks at with respect to the key risk indicators or the quality tolerance limits. And this centralized statistical monitoring tool is an option to identify additional risks that had not been identified originally. Risks that have a high impact, even if less likely to occur, may also be addressed, especially in relation to human subject protection. So therefore, this no with the exclamation mark up here also applies in that case. And monitoring plans should allow for the fact that unexpected risk may emerge and they may need to be updated. So this is then feeding back into the a regular review of the risks that, for instance, monitors find certain things that do not really work well, and they may feed that back into the risk assessment team, and then for the next release, new risks may be added to the risk plan and therefore then can be addressed by the organization. So in summary, and this is our statement here, our summary, the risk identification continues throughout the trial. And use your critical thinking and pay attention to, in particular, what site monitors may see and come up with. So that addresses question number 2, and then let's move on to number 3. What factors should sponsors consider when determining the timing, types, frequency, and the extent of monitoring activities? That in itself is a rather difficult question. And Keith and I, when we discussed that, we concluded that the best answer is always, it depends. And unfortunately, also in this case, we have to state that it depends. So what one has to take into account, and this is the FDA response, is consider the trial and site level risks. So do not only look at the trial level, but also at the site level, maybe even at regional level, country level, if that is applicable. Some sites have a higher risk or come along with a higher risk than others due to, for instance, the principal investigator experience, the sponsor experience of the site infrastructure, the EDC use and how the EDC is being used, the study complexity, the amount and criticality of the data collected, maybe also the volume of the data collected, the staffing resources, the locations where participants will be seen, and it may also depend on the therapeutic area experience of the sponsor company or of the CRO or of the investigators involved. So there are many, many different factors that need to be taken into account when thinking about the timing, types, and frequency of the monitoring activities. Centralized monitoring can be advantageous. I don't know why they use the word can be here, but I personally think that centralized monitoring is probably for almost all studies advantageous, at least the larger ones. The source data verification, and I find that quite interesting. The source data verification may be part of a risk-based approach. By focusing on risk to critical data and processes should allow a reduced level, that means not 100%. So there is definitely a statement by the FDA saying source data verification should be part of your risk-based approach, but please do not do 100% SDV for the entire study, for all the patients, for all the data points. And then finally, the benefit of early monitoring soon after first few trial participants had been enrolled. Actually, I think that is what I've seen in the majority of the companies doing, that the first patient at a site, or maybe the first 2 patients at a site, are being monitored, and not only monitored, but source data verified very carefully. And that also then feeds back into the approach of centralized monitoring and the frequency of the monitoring visits at the site. So bottom line, or in summary, consider site level risks before and during the study, and modify site level monitoring based on the risk and based on the findings that you see in your study. Because when you see a site that does not improve the quality of the data, or is lacking behind with respect to data entry, or has an underreporting of serious adverse events, that site probably needs much more handholding, and the likelihood of errors done by such a site is certainly much higher compared to a site where they have enough staff, the data entry is being done properly in a timely fashion, the data are rather clean in the first place. Then you can certainly level off the source data verification for such a site. Question number 4. How can a risk-based approach to monitoring that includes centralized monitoring help minimize missing data or protocol deviation? Now, this is what Keith and I think, talked about for many webinars. So this is the answer then from the FDA. Centralized monitoring is a systematic analytical evaluation of study conduct across multiple clinical sites, carried out by sponsor personnel or representatives. So for instance, clinical monitors, data management personnel, or statisticians. So that's a pretty clear definition, that a central monitor should not focus on the nitty-gritty details at a site, but do a systematic evaluation of the study across multiple sites. So please keep that first bullet point in mind, because it's getting a little more confusing in the next couple of bullet points. The central monitor can help to find inconsistencies or omissions. I think that's pretty clear. If there are inconsistencies in the data, missing endpoints, etc., that is something that a central monitor may easily see. Check for completeness and consistency. Also, that is something a central monitor can do, in particular for the completeness. The consistency is probably something that edit checks in an EDC system can also support. But that is something that a central monitor should focus on. Then the next one is verify source data. Neither Keith nor myself had an idea how that is supposed to happen, other than worst case via remote monitoring. But remote monitoring has its peculiarities, these special problems, let's put it that way. And therefore we found this statement, this bullet point, quite surprising. Keith, do you want to jump in right now?
Well, yes, yes, absolutely. It does seem odd, and it's interesting somebody picked that up at the beginning too, especially given their definition of centralized monitoring, as you say, a systematic analytical evaluation. So I don't know whether they mean, as you say, that centralized monitoring is including a review of somehow of source data. I don't know. It doesn't sort of add up. And in fact, the next one doesn't quite add up either, I don't think.
Yeah. Well, the next one is one that at least I can imagine that a central monitor may have access to, so that the IRB is up to date. Yes, you can check that sort of in-house, not necessarily check it at each and every site that participates. And the same is true for the informed consent form documentation. How are you supposed to do that? Because the informed consent form documentation sits with the sites. That again may mean remote monitoring. Show me the document that the patient signed. very unlikely. And I personally think it's not really practical. This is, in my opinion, a task that a site monitor should and could focus on.
Unless, I suppose, if it was electronic ICF, yeah, you might have the opportunity then, I suppose.
Yes. In that case, that may be true.
And I see there's a comment.
Yeah.
Yeah, I interpreted this as centralized monitoring can help identify the source that should be verified. And maybe that's what they meant. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
English is a difficult language.
Tell me about it.
But yeah, I like that approach, and maybe we should just use that as the interpretation that in this case a central monitor points a site monitor to the area that he or she should focus on.
Yeah, and I see there's another comment. Yes, as I mentioned about e-consent. Yeah, so if you're using e-consent, then or e-ICF, then yeah, there is the potential for more use of centralized monitoring, of course, in that. But yeah.
The question, of course, remains how many e-consent systems are being used these days in clinical studies. What is the level of usage of the systems? But we found that also quite interesting. Another comment, this seems to trigger lots of comments. So some eCRFs also provide query categories like source data verification failure. These can then be analyzed centrally. Yes. But the question is really whether that is meant by verify source data, because originally the first bullet point says, apply a systematic analytical evaluation across multiple sites. And across multiple sites to me means, don't look at a patient level or at a visit level, but rather look at the overarching information that you can extract from whatever the sites provide. So I have the impression, maybe Keith, this is another webinar, maybe.
Yeah, that SDV piece. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, I think we got to move on. Yes, and then whether an on-site monitoring visit is needed, that is certainly something that a central monitor can trigger, so that the central monitor, based on the information that a system or the person created, can support a site monitor with respect to the planning of the next site visit. Though that makes a lot of sense. By reviewing study data and metadata in real time, issues can be detected earlier and action taken to reduce the likelihood of recurrence. Again, Keith and I found that rather surprising, not by reviewing the study data, but the metadata review in real time. That is something that I personally don't think a central monitor, let's say the majority of the central monitors will be able to want to have the tools to analyze and review. So metadata review is something that I personally see in a different organization other than the central monitoring function. Yes, metadata is audit trail, but metadata may also be other data that describe the structure of a study, for instance. So if that is the audit trail data, you need tools, because you cannot analyze audit trail data by looking at the audit trail, because usually you have, let's say, 100% data, and when you take a look at the audit trail, it's about an additional 500%. So just volume-wise, and analyzing an audit trail without any tools is almost impossible. I would say it is impossible for a study larger than 50 subjects. So centralized monitoring is certainly a powerful additional tool that could help streamline the study conduct, support the monitors at the site, and help an organization to move a study smoothly from start to the end. And the next one, should a risk-based monitoring approach include processes to ensure that the appropriate blinding is maintained? The answer is yes, blinding should be considered as part of the risk assessment. What Keith and I discussed is whether that is always done. And actually, when thinking about it, I have the impression that a smart central monitor, and the same is true for a smart medical monitor, will almost be able to unblind a study based on the adverse events that, for instance, can be seen, based on certain vital sign parameters, based on lab parameters, based on many other things. So I personally think it's really a tricky thing to run a thorough risk assessment and review of the data on one hand and maintain the blinding on the other hand. That's really, really difficult. And I have seen that actually what you see here in the second bullet point, deviations that could result in unintentional unblinding of treatment assignment should be identified and tracked. Yes, I can imagine that it just happens. And it may mean that you need to remove a central monitor from, let's say, the core team of a study, so that this is an independent individual that is supposed to keep everything that he or she sees during the central monitoring activities, that he or she keeps those aspects to him or herself that may result in an unintentional unblinding. We all know that blinding is a critical part of a clinical trial and should be included in RBQM. And for all the blinded studies that we have set up so far, blinding was a category that cause, or that is having some risk associated with it. It's blinding, it is stratification, is always one of the potential risks in risk assessment. So from the first 5 questions, you can already conclude that it's obviously not that simple and straightforward as one may have expected or thought, but I think we have to sort of live with the FDA answers and try to build that into our studies. And Keith, I think with that, you take over for the next couple of questions.
Yes, thanks, Johan. So question 6, what elements should sponsors include in monitoring plans? So you can see we've got monitoring plans in plural here. I'm not quite sure whether they mean there could be multiple plans on one study or plans across studies. And perhaps that detail doesn't necessarily matter too much. I guess they're not being prescriptive about that, as Johan was saying earlier. But here they do refer back to that 2013 guidance. So as I say, if you haven't had a look at that, it's worth taking a look, because there's a lot of more detail around the monitoring plan and what should be included in that guidance. And then they say in addition to that, there's some more items too that you should include, and that's what we've listed here. So the description of the study design, processes to confirm correct randomization, the sampling plan for which data will be monitored, why and how. So I guess that's getting into critical data and risks, the types of issues that would trigger immediate action. So I guess sort of escalation, immediate escalation, or escalation process, and a process to determine if an issue is systemic. So, and then they go on to describe that to other sites and or due to the protocol or other plans. So, so those are the bits they add. But really, I mean, my takeaway from this is they're confirming the need for a very comprehensive monitoring plan. I see there's a comment there. Could the last bullet be referring to QTLs? Possibly. I know, because they say QTLs are focused on sort of capturing systemic issues. Possibly, but I suppose there's QTLs isn't the only way you might potentially pick up systemic issues. But yeah, what is the process to determine if an issue is systemic? So I suppose part of that could be QTLs, but I think there would be more to it than that, because I think as part of your centralized monitoring, at least, you'd want to be, if there looked to be something systematic or systemic, then there'd need to be some level of review of what was discovered. So how are potential issues from centralized monitoring, how are they assessed to determine if they are perhaps systemic or not? So to me, it seems like they're sort of describing that, and part of that could certainly be quality tolerance limits. So question 7, how should sponsors follow up on significant issues identified through monitoring, including communication of such issues? So they just restate, really, the aim is to reduce the impact of the issue on the right, safety and welfare of trial participants and or data integrity. So that's sort of, that's ICH E6R2 language. Root cause analysis followed by corrective preventive actions. Again, that's ICH E6R2. They give some examples of the sorts of actions. I was interested to see these. I know in the original, the draft, this was one of the areas that really surprised me, and I'm glad they've changed it. They said retraining of the site. So anyone that knows me knows that as soon as I see retraining, it's like a red rag to a bull. But they've changed it to improved training of the site. So I was very pleased to see that. I mean, some of these are obviously quite significant, potentially halting enrollment at the site. Clarifying, revising the protocol, other study documents, increasing trial support. I thought these are all good action examples, actually, and it's nice to see some examples in the document.
Other than Keith revising the protocol, because that is really a major step that you would have to undertake, and almost results in halting the enrollment at a study or at a site. Sorry.
Absolutely. So, yes. Yeah, good point. Then they talk about reviewing the risk assessment, the monitoring plan. So this is, remember, this is you've identified an issue. So go back to the risk assessment. That's the risk review piece that we've talked about. The monitoring plan. So what, if it should have been picked up earlier, why wasn't it? Or can you pick it up earlier if something like that might happen again? So the monitoring plan, other study plans in case there is some level of revision that's needed. And surprise, surprise, significant issues should be communicated to appropriate parties. That communication piece. So they're really, to me, they're saying that, there needs to be a comprehensive approach to issue management. So that's question 7. And I think question 8, that's the last of them. How should monitoring activities and the results of these activities be documented and shared with those involved in the investigation? And again, they refer back to the 2013 guidance. So include the date, who was involved, a summary of data activities reviewed, description of findings, description of actions taken or needed. The documentation should be sufficient to allow verification of adherence to the monitoring plan. So, I mean, I don't think anybody would be surprised to see something like that. So if you've got a monitoring plan, a perfectly reasonable question from an inspector is going to be, okay, I see your monitoring plan. Now, how can you demonstrate to me that that was actually followed? And so, of course, that's proper documentation that it was adhered to. There should be no surprise. Monitoring activities include on-site and remote, as well as centralized monitoring across sites. So they're now explicitly talking about centralized monitoring as part of monitoring. So monitoring being on-site, remote, which I'm taking as being reviewing site information, but doing it remotely, so at a site level, and then centralized monitoring, looking at across the sites as per their definition we saw earlier. And any reports from monitoring activities should be provided to management. And remember, because they've now said monitoring activities includes centralized monitoring, that means that centralized monitoring should be, or reports of centralized monitoring should be provided to management. So it's not just monitoring visit reports, but it's reports of the centralized monitoring activities too, including, and they give examples, including sponsor staff responsible for conduct and oversight. So in other words, if it's being done, the centralized monitoring by a CRO, then reports of the centralized monitoring activity should be going through to the sponsor for oversight purposes. And again, we've said it many times before, the documentation should tell the story. So that's the 8 questions that we've just gone through with our thoughts, at least. I mean, we'll just open it up here for any further thoughts from you, or what are your key takeaways? And again, I would encourage you, if you haven't read it yet, do go and read it. It is worth reading, and it doesn't take that long. But those are our perspectives. What are your key takeaways from the guidance?
If you would like to write something on the whiteboard here, then just click on the cup, please. Next, click on the T in the box, and then you can start writing. Are there any key takeaways from the recently finalized FDA guidance? I'll leave the whiteboard open, and perhaps we can start talking about what is listed here already.
Yeah, so the FDA is doubling down on every study using a risk-based approach. So if anyone out there was still thinking they could get away without a risk-based approach, this makes it absolutely clear. I mean, there shouldn't be anybody out there that thought that, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're making it absolutely clear, and they have this reference to focusing on critical data, critical process. They're highly encouraging centralized monitoring. So they define monitoring as which I thought was interesting, on-site, remote, and including centralized monitoring. And they talk about the benefits of centralized monitoring. The study blind, I think, again, is another interesting area, definitely. And I know, Johan, you've said that you've always seen it as in a risk assessment. I haven't actually. Mm-hmm. And so it's almost like one of those that there should be a list that says, you must cover these areas as you do the risk assessment. I know it's in the list from the Transaccelerate,
yes.
Isn't it?
Yes, it's one of the categories, and as I said, for the blinded studies that we came across, it was always a section that sponsor companies wanted to focus on, wanted to ensure that blinding worked out properly.
Yeah. And then this one, yes, that's the question about STV comes up again and again, doesn't it? And do we need 100% STV? And still, that's almost seemed to be the gold standard. And I think it sort of isn't at all, really. But people are worried, and they have been worried for a long time. But that's what the regulators really want, isn't it? And they are being explicit now and saying, there should be a risk-based approach, that means not necessarily 100% STV. So they are being explicit about that now, and absolutely support for centralized monitoring. And I see that's really that point at the bottom there too. They're pushing for less than, I don't know whether it's subtle, perhaps less subtle now than it was, for less than 100% STV and for more centralized monitoring. Okay, yeah, I was hoping for more of a shove. But I guess, you know, they are saying it's your responsibility. You take a risk-based approach. If in your risk-based approach you think actually we need to do 100% STV, then that's what you need to do. But they are, you know, I guess they don't want to be too prescriptive, but the point is they're pushing the risk-based approach. So if you're doing 100% STV, you know, that better be done on a risk-based approach. Yeah, and the importance of documentation. And FDA don't entirely differentiate centralized monitoring activities from site and remote monitoring. An interesting point. I think, yes, that definition of monitoring, I think, is interesting because they sort of group them together. But then, of course, they define central or centralized monitoring as looking for systemic, sort of systemic issues and looking across sites, don't they? Yeah. Anything else on these from your perspective, Johan?
No, I think you covered it nicely, and interesting responses that we have here on this whiteboard. In summary, one can really conclude that yes, the FDA answers helped for maybe 80% of the questions, but there are still some that require either more clarification, or we just take whatever the FDA said and try to implement what we understood. It's not necessarily 100% clear in all cases.
But hopefully it's added some clarity at least. Yes,
yeah,
I think it has. But as ever, there's you know still questions there, I guess. Yeah. I see there's a comment there about the source data piece, the verify source data and metadata. This person is saying it might be linked to expectations from the FDA. For example, if the primary endpoint data is ePro, then the FDA have an expectation that ePro metadata is checked programmatically to make sure, for example, that the timing of data entry across patients is not in a pattern. So, and the comment here says that they've actually seen the questions along these lines during an FDA inspection. So, thank you for that.
There's another comment or question. Does reduced source data verification equal to reduced source data review? No, I don't think so. At least I think that source data verification and source data review are two separate processes, and FDA always talks about source data verification. So that is the comparison of the data in the whatever EDC system or in the paper case report forms against the source, or the source against the EDC data. But source data review is again at a much higher level and is more related to the overall monitoring process, what a site monitor should do at the site, and that is not only source data verification. Yes, and source data verification might be reduced, but source data review should be 100%. That is my understanding, yes. Okay, I hope that helped. And here we go, and are already in the summary section. So what we try to get across to you is that this guidance provides more clarity on the FDA perspective on risk-based quality management. And they try also to align ICH E6R2 and ICH E8R1. And Keith, the other day, yesterday or so, you said that ICH 6R3 is still in discussion, and we shouldn't expect it to be released in the first half of 2023, but rather towards the end of 2023. So I found that quite an interesting information that you.
Yeah, that was from the blog, the MHRA blog, and they said that we're expecting. So it was quite a surprise to me, because everything I've heard in the industry, people have been saying, "Oh, well, the final E6R3 is coming out very soon," but the MHRA blogs were saying, "No, we're at step 2. It will be issued soon in a draft format, ready for public consultation," which sort of suggests to me that the final E6R3 is still quite a way off. It doesn't match with what's the timings on the ICH website, but I mean that's the latest information. So personally, I'd be surprised if we see the final ICH E6R3 before next year, because if you're waiting for all that public consultation review, that we know E8R1 took a couple of years. Mind you, there was a pandemic, so
yeah, certainly true. Yeah, most of the answers from FDA are not surprising. So, for instance, the support for the risk assessments, the centralized monitoring approach, the ongoing risk review and revision of the risk review, and of course, the documentation of each and everything that we do in the industry. But there are a couple of interesting areas: the site level risk management. So not only at the study level, but also taking a look at the site level by a central monitor, that the central monitor can help checking the source data and also ensures that the IRB and the ICF are up to date, and taking a look at the metadata as well. And blinding should always be included in the risk assessment. Of course, that is only true for blinded studies. If you have an unblinded, still randomized study, then you don't need that section in your risk assessment in your overall. And with that, we arrive at the questions and answers.
Exactly, and there is already one question. Is there guidance that suggests 100% SDR should be done?
Not that I'm aware of, but Keith, anything from your side?
No, not that I'm aware of. No, it was Transcelerate, wasn't it, that brought out this distinction between SDV and SDR. Yeah.
And if there are any questions, don't hesitate, please, and just put them into the chat and send it to us.
And thanks for all your questions throughout, because that it's always good to have it, have your comments and questions as we go as well.
Okay, then I would say we have reached the end of the workshop, and if you have further questions, just email us at academy@syntegrity.com or visit our RBQM Academy online at academy.syntegrity.com.